Condemned to die in service, Garin Vale expected pain and blood. He didn't expect to find something worth living for in the Emperor's wars, or to lose it in ways no battlefield wound could match. The chains rattled with every step, a dry metallic chorus that followed Garin Vale down the loading corridor like the whisper of vultures. They bit into his wrists and ankles, not deep enough to draw blood, but enough to remind him what he was, property now, not a man. His prison number, P99721, had been burned into the flesh of his neck the night they sentenced him. He stopped touching the scar weeks ago. The skin was too raw, and the memory of that branding iron too clear. Ahead, the corridor opened into the staging chamber, where hundreds like him shuffled forward under the watch of silent, faceless guards, penal legionnaires, the Emperor's disposable soldiers. Garin had worked grain mills before his arrest. Not glamorous work, but honest, steady, and far removed from the Imperial Guard. That life was gone now. One drunken brawl and a corpse in the mud had stripped him of everything: name, freedom, future. He hadn't even remembered throwing the punch, but the man had died when his skull struck the edge of a feed auger, and the magistratum hadn't cared whether it was an accident. Terra's justice was clear: every criminal paid in blood or service. Garin chose service, or maybe it was chosen for him. He wasn't sure anymore. The chamber was cavernous, echoing with the shuffle of chains and the harsh bark of orders. Rows of men and women stood in grim formation, heads shaved, uniforms a rough patchwork of gray and brown, each marked with a blinking collar at the throat. One wrong move, one step out of line, and the collar would detonate, spraying whatever remained across the chamber floor. Garin tried not to look at the dark stains between the tiles. He already knew what they meant. He found his place in line, second row, third column, beside a lean man with a crooked nose and eyes like cold ash. "Garin Vale," he muttered, introducing himself quietly, more out of old habit than expectation of response. "Jorek," the man grunted. "Former ganger, now dead man walking, same as you." It wasn't camaraderie, but in the Legion, even a word could feel like a lifeline. The briefing began without ceremony. A commissar in a crisp black coat strode onto the raised platform, flanked by stormtroopers. His voice, amplified by a Vox unit, cut through the chamber like a blade. "You are here because you have failed the Emperor," he declared. "Your crimes have marked you as expendable, but even the worthless can find redemption in service. You will fight, you will bleed, and you will die. If you die well, your families may be spared your shame. If you die poorly," he paused, letting the silence stretch until it felt like a physical weight pressing on every chest, "no one will remember you." Garin kept his face blank. He'd seen what happened to those who flinched or spoke out of turn. The commissar's hand rested lightly on the bolt pistol at his hip, a promise rather than a threat. A few rows ahead, someone coughed. A stormtrooper raised his weapon. The coughing stopped. Then came the implants. Tech priests scuttled among the prisoners like crimson carrion birds, their mechanoidrils probing and clicking. Each legionnaire was fitted with a cranial control spike, a slender rod drilled into the base of the skull, connecting nerves to the detonation collar and the control network. The process was quick but brutal. Garin watched one man faint mid-procedure. The tech priest didn't even pause, finishing the installation as the man's body spasmed on the floor. When Garin's turn came, they didn't numb him. They clamped his head, forced him to his knees, and drove the spike home. His vision went white, and the taste of copper flooded his mouth. By the time he could see again, the tech priest had moved on. After the fitting, they were herded into transports like cattle. The interior of the troop ship stank of oil, sweat, and fear. Rows of harnesses lined the walls. Garin strapped himself in, his hands shaking despite his effort to appear calm. Across from him sat Jorek, two young women who couldn't have been more than 20, and an older man with the hardened look of someone who'd survived more than one war. "First time?" the older man asked, his voice gravelly. "Yeah," Garin replied. "Don't think too much," the man said. "You'll last longer if you don't think." The transport shuddered as it launched. Grav pressure pressed Garin into the harness, and the roar of engines drowned out all other sound. He thought of the prison cell he'd left behind, of the mill floor where his life had once been small but predictable. Now, the galaxy yawned before him, full of war zones he couldn't even name. He didn't know where they were going, only that few Penal Legion regiments ever came back. Hours or maybe days passed in the void. Time blurred, some prisoners prayed, others slept fitfully. Garen sat in silence, counting his breaths, clinging to the rhythm like a drowning man to driftwood. He found himself staring at the older man across from him, wondering how someone like that ended up here. Before he could ask, the klaxons began to wail. Red lights bathed the compartment. The intercom crackled to life. "Prepare for drop. Combat zone imminent. Emperors will be done." The harnesses snapped open. The doors yawned wide, revealing the sickly green atmosphere of some distant world. Smoke columns spiraled in the distance. Artillery thunder rolled like a storm. Penal Legion soldiers stumbled into the drop bay, blinking against the light. A sergeant in flak armor stood before them, scarred and sour. "You're not soldiers," he barked. "You're meat. The enemy is ahead. You run forward until you die. Maybe, just maybe, you'll last long enough to earn a bullet instead of a collar detonation. Move." The push began. They ran down the ramps and into hell. The air was thick with spores and ash, stinging Garen's lungs. The ground churned with mud and blood. Somewhere ahead, lasguns snapped and heavy bolters roared. The enemy, whoever they were, was close. Garen could see figures moving in the haze, shapes too fast, too many. A man to his left took a hit to the chest and folded without a sound. Another stepped on a mine. The explosion threw Garen to the ground, ears ringing. He clawed his way up, stumbling after the surge of bodies, the collar around his neck blinking insistently. He didn't remember reaching the front line. One moment he was running, the next he was huddled in a shell crater beside Jorek, gasping for air. Overhead, tracer fire carved the sky into ribbons of light. The enemy was close enough now that Garen could hear their shrieks, alien, furious, nothing human in them. "First taste of war," Jorek muttered. His grin was wild, manic. "Ain't it sweet?" Garen couldn't answer. The shrieks grew louder. Something moved in the fog ahead, a shadow with too many limbs. The Penal Legionnaires fired blindly. Someone screamed. Then the shadow surged forward. The first wave hit like a hammer. Garen didn't see the creature clearly in those first seconds. He saw only blur and motion, the snapping flash of muzzle flares lighting a form that seemed to shift with each heartbeat. Limbs clawed at the edges of the crater, dragging themselves over the lip with insectal strength. And then it was among them, and the Penal Legion dissolved into chaos. Men and women who had been herded like cattle moments ago now screamed like animals in a slaughterhouse. Lasfire lanced through the fog, searing the night with crimson lines that vanished into the mass of shadows. Someone beside Garen unloaded an entire magazine into the thing's torso, but it didn't fall. It folded around the shots, flowed through them like water, and came on anyway. Garen's hands shook as he raised his own battered lasgun, aiming without thinking, just reacting. The recoil was light, the crackling discharge almost lost in the cacophony, but the creature shrieked when the shot caught its flank, a wet, keening sound that made the hair rise on the back of his neck. Jorek had already sprung forward with the suicidal bravado of someone who didn't believe he'd live to see another dawn. He jammed his bayonet into what might have been a ribcage, yelling like a madman. The creature swung back, its claws slicing through the air, and Jorek stumbled away laughing, his sleeve shredded but his arm miraculously intact. More shadows emerged. Garen counted 3, then lost count as the fog seemed to birth them endlessly. The Penal Legion line fractured, panic setting in like rot. Some turned to run back toward the drop site, only to crumple as their collars detonated, painting the mud with blood and bone. The message was clear: forward or die. A sergeant waded into the chaos, Voxcaster crackling at his shoulder. "Hold the line, you scum. Hold it or I'll detonate every last one of you myself." His bolt pistol barked, sending explosive shells into the advancing swarm. One creature's head vanished in a spray of ichor, but the others didn't even slow. Garen dropped to one knee beside a supply crate and fired until the barrel of his gun glowed faintly. The fog distorted everything. He couldn't tell if they were winning or simply delaying the inevitable. Then came the sound. A low, rising hum that seemed to come from beneath the ground, vibrating through Garen's boots up his legs into his chest. The creatures froze, their heads cocking as if listening to something far away. The penal legionnaires faltered, uncertain. And then the sky split. An orbital strike, maybe, or some Imperial artillery piece kilometers behind their position. Whatever it was, it landed with the fury of a god. The ground bucked, the air turned to fire, and Garen was thrown backward, his breath torn from his lungs. For a moment the world became white noise and burning light. When he blinked the afterimages away, the creatures were gone, reduced to smoldering carcasses scattered across the battlefield. The fog had lifted somewhat, revealing a blasted landscape of craters and shattered structures that might once have been a settlement. "Up!" someone screamed. "Form up, you filth, form up!" Garen stumbled to his feet, ears ringing, vision swimming. Around him, survivors clawed their way out of the mud, dazed but alive. Jorek appeared at his side, blood smeared across his cheek but grinning. "First wave's done," he said. "They'll send more." Garen didn't reply. His throat was dry, his heart hammering. He stared at the corpses, at the smoking ruin of whatever those things had been, and felt something close to awe. He'd expected to die in his first engagement. Most penal soldiers did, but he was still here, for now. The line reformed under the barked orders of the sergeant and the cold gaze of the commissar, who had appeared as if summoned by blood. His coat was immaculate, his expression carved from stone. He moved among the legionnaires like a carrion bird, noting weakness, cataloging fear. One young woman, barely more than a girl, was shaking so hard her lasgun clattered against her armor. The commissar stopped before her. "Name," he said. "El Lissara," she stammered. "You will steady yourself, Lissara," he said, voice calm, almost gentle. "You will fight, you will serve, or you will die now." She tried to speak, but only a choked sob came out. The commissar raised his bolt pistol and shot her in the head. The report was deafening at close range. She crumpled soundlessly, and the commissar stepped over her body without breaking stride. Garen flinched but forced his gaze forward. Fear was a currency here, and weakness a death sentence. Hours bled away in fits and starts as the penal legion dug in. Trenches were carved hastily from the mud with entrenching tools. Sandbags were piled, weapon emplacements rigged from scavenged materials. Garen worked silently beside Jorek, their hands numb from cold and exhaustion. Overhead, the sky burned a sickly green, storm clouds swirling with unnatural patterns. The air smelled of ozone and rot. In the distance, the enemy massed again. He could hear them moving, a chittering, clicking sound that set his teeth on edge. Word filtered through the lines in whispers, tyranids. A splinter fleet, they said, small enough to be dealt with, large enough to consume everything in its path. Garen didn't know much about tyranids, but he knew enough. They didn't stop. Night fell, though it was hard to tell with the alien sky. The fog returned, thicker this time, creeping into the trenches like a living thing. Garen huddled in the mud, lasgun across his knees, collar blinking faintly in the dark. Jorek sat beside him, gnawing on a ration bar that smelled faintly of machine oil. "You ever think about redemption?" Jorek asked suddenly. Garen looked at him. "No." "I do," Jorek said. "Not the ecclesiarchy kind, not all that prayer and incense. Real redemption, dying in a way that means something. Maybe they remember your name, maybe they don't, but you get to choose the how." Garen didn't answer. He didn't believe in redemption. He believed in survival. The attack came in the early hours, heralded by a sound like tearing metal. The tyranids swarmed from the darkness in a wave of claws and teeth, their carapaces glistening with alien fluids. The trenches erupted in lasfire and screams. Garen fired until his arms ached, until his fingers went numb from squeezing the trigger. The creatures fell in heaps, but for each one that died, two more seemed to take its place. The line buckled. Men and women vanished under the tide, dragged down, their collars blinking frantically before detonating. Garen found himself shoulder to shoulder with Jorek, the two of them backpedaling as the trench filled with bodies. A gaunt tyrannid leapt at them, its jaws wide, and Garen jammed his lasgun into its mouth, firing point-blank. The creature convulsed and collapsed, pinning him beneath its weight. Panic clawed at his throat as he struggled to push it off. Jorek grabbed his arm and hauled him free, cursing. They fell back to the secondary line, a shallow ditch barely worthy of the name. The commissar was there, his voice cutting through the din like a whip. "Hold, you dogs! Hold, or you'll die screaming!" His pistol barked again and again, each shot finding a target among both enemy and his own troops when they faltered. A shadow passed overhead, momentarily blotting out the burning sky. Garen glanced up and saw the bulk of an Imperial dropship descending through the smoke, its engines screaming. Reinforcements, supplies, he didn't know, but the sight filled him with a flicker of something dangerous: hope. That hope lasted exactly 3 seconds. The dropship exploded mid-descent, a blossom of fire and debris scattering across the battlefield. A tyrannid biocannon had found its mark. The wreckage slammed into the front lines, crushing dozens beneath twisted metal. Garen stared, stunned, as the last fragments burned out against the alien sky. Jorek spat, "So much for hope." The attack didn't stop. It never stopped. Garen lost track of time, of the number of times they fell back and reformed, of how many comrades were reduced to bloody smears in the mud. His world narrowed to the lasgun in his hands, the mud beneath his boots, and the constant, relentless scream of the tyrannid swarm. Somewhere in that endless night, something inside him shifted. He stopped thinking of himself as Garen Vale, mill worker and convict. He became a weapon, as disposable as the lasgun he carried. His mind numbed, his fear dulled. There was only the fight and the fleeting, bitter satisfaction of surviving another minute. And then, amid the chaos, he saw her. She was slight, maybe 25, her uniform the same filthy gray as everyone else's, her hair cropped short, face streaked with grime. She moved through the trench line with calm precision, checking weapons, dragging wounded back from the front, shouting orders when the sergeants fell. She wasn't an officer, she wore no rank, but people listened to her. Her name, he learned later, was Elira. In that hellscape, she was something he hadn't felt in a long time, a reason to keep breathing. Garen first truly noticed Elira when the dawn finally broke, not with sunlight, for this world hadn't seen a true sunrise since the Tyranids arrived, but with the pale, sickly light that seeped through the roiling cloud cover like a dying ember. The fog had thinned enough for him to see her clearly, crouched beside a shattered emplacement, binding the stump of a man's leg with brutal efficiency. The soldier screamed, thrashing weakly, but she held him down with a strength that didn't match her frame. Blood soaked her sleeves to the elbow. Her expression never wavered. She tied the tourniquet tight, handed him a shot of stim to keep him alive a little longer, and then moved on without looking back. Garen leaned against the trench wall, lasgun slack in his hands, feeling that bone-deep exhaustion that didn't just sit in the muscles but in the soul. The night had been endless, the tyrannid attacks relentless, and still they were alive. Barely. He looked at the faces around him, gaunt, hollow-eyed, smeared with blood and filth, and saw that survival had stripped them down to something raw. These were not soldiers. They were the damned, held together by fear, hate, and the threat of detonation collars. And yet somehow, Elira made them move like they mattered. She noticed him watching her. For a moment their eyes met across the trench. Hers were sharp, startlingly clear amid the grime, and there was no softness in them. But there was something else, a spark, a refusal to surrender to the mud and horror. She gave him a curt nod and moved on, hauling a crate of munitions toward the next gun pit. Garen wasn't sure why that small acknowledgement struck him so hard. Maybe because no one had looked at him like a person in a long time. The morning brought a lull, but not relief. The officers, those not yet dead, pushed through the trench lines with data slates and half-functioning Vox units, barking conflicting orders. Someone mentioned an incoming resupply drop. Someone else said the fleet was pulling back. A rumor swept through the Legion that the entire regiment was being written off as a delaying action to buy time for the evacuation of the Hive city to the north. Garen didn't know if any of it was true, and he wasn't sure it mattered. The Tyranids didn't care about orders or strategy. They would come, and they would devour. He climbed up onto the firing step and peered over the trench lip. The battlefield stretched out like a nightmare. Blackened earth churned to sludge, carcasses of both men and monsters piled in obscene mounds, wrecked vehicles half sunk into the mud. In the far distance, the alien horde was moving again, a dark, shifting carpet advancing with terrible inevitability. He felt that old, familiar tightening in his chest. Fear. Always fear. Jorek stumbled up beside him, chewing on what might have been the last of his ration bar. His eyes were bloodshot, his grin as crooked as ever. "You see that? They're coming again, like they don't get tired, bastards." "They don't," Garen said quietly. Jorek spat into the mud. "You ever wonder if Command even remembers we're down here? Penal Legion, frontline, no armor, no artillery worth a damn. Feels like they're just waiting for us to die so they can carpet bomb the place." Garen didn't answer because he had wondered that, often. A harsh crackle came from the Vox speaker nailed to a post above the trench. The voice of a commissar, different from the one last night, this one clipped and brisk, filled the air. "Attention all units. Resupply shuttle inbound. Maintain defensive positions. Prepare for incoming drop zone at grid 16 Delta." The reaction was immediate. Legionnaires scrambled to clear space, to set up signaling flares, to drag the wounded out of the impact zone. Garen found himself swept up in the motion, not because he believed supplies would save them, but because motion kept the fear at bay. The shuttle appeared through the cloud layer as a dull shape trailing smoke. Its descent was erratic, buffeted by atmospheric turbulence and Tyranid spore mines that burst like bloated ticks in the sky. Anti-air lasfire streaked upward from the trenches, swatting at the mines, clearing a path. For a moment, Garen allowed himself the dangerous luxury of hope. The shuttle hit the ground hard, skidding through the mud and throwing up a wave of filth. Its rear ramp slammed down, and servitors rolled out crates of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. More astonishingly, a squad of Tempestus Scions emerged, their carapace armor gleaming despite the muck, their movements crisp and disciplined. Real soldiers, the kind who had a chance of surviving. The penal legionnaires stared at them like men glimpsing angels, though these angels were armed to the teeth and radiated contempt. One Scion officer barked orders at the commissar, his tone making it clear he was used to obedience. The commissar, for once, inclined his head. Supplies were distributed swiftly, efficiently, and for the first time since landing, the Legion's lasguns had full charge packs. Alira moved through the chaos like she belonged there. Garen saw her helping organize medical stations, pointing out which crates went where, somehow cutting through the confusion with her sharp voice. She wasn't officially in command of anything, but everyone listened. Even some of the Scions gave her second glances, clearly surprised at her competence. Garen found himself assigned to carry ammunition crates toward the eastern trench line. As he staggered under the weight, Alira appeared beside him, taking the other end without asking. Up close, he noticed the faint scar running from her left temple down to her jawline, a thin, pale line that looked old. She smelled of blood and ozone. "Your Vale right?" she asked without preamble. He blinked. "Garen Vale." She nodded curtly. "You shoot straight. I saw you last night. Keep doing that. We'll need every steady gun we've got." He wanted to ask her why she cared, why she bothered to remember names in a place where most people died before introductions mattered. But she was already moving again, calling out to another squad to dig firing pits deeper. By midday, the next wave hit. It began with the sky darkening as tyrannid spore pods fell like grotesque meteors, punching craters into the no-man's land. The first lines of hormagaunts sprinted across the mud, claws flashing, moving with insectal precision. The trenches roared to life, lasguns blazing, autocannons thudding, scions laying down disciplined volleys. The air turned thick with smoke, heat, and the stench of burning alien flesh. Garen fired until his arms ached, swapping out charge packs mechanically, like part of the gun itself. Around him, legionnaires died by the dozen, but the line held longer this time. The presence of the scions and the fresh ammunition made a difference. The tyrannids piled up against the trench like waves against rocks, breaking themselves on disciplined fire. Jorek whooped as he lobbed a grenade into a cluster of gaunts, the explosion sending limbs flying. "Maybe we'll live through this after all," he shouted. The words were barely out of his mouth when a tyrannid warrior vaulted over the trench wall, its massive claws sweeping through the air. It caught Jorek across the chest, hurling him backward into the mud. Garen swung his lasgun up and fired point-blank into the creature's face, the beam punching through one eye. It roared and collapsed on top of him, thrashing blindly. Garen struggled beneath its weight, feeling its blood, hot and strangely viscous, pour over him. Hands grabbed the carcass and heaved it aside. Illyra was there, panting, laspistol still smoking. She knelt beside Jorek, but one look told Garen the truth. The gash across his torso was deep, fatal. Jorek's grin was gone, replaced by the wide-eyed stare of someone who knew exactly what awaited him. "Vale," he croaked, blood bubbling at his lips. "Don't waste it, the time they give you, don't waste it." His hand went limp. Illyra closed his eyes with a grim set to her jaw. The line wavered as more warriors surged forward, supported by strange, lumbering creatures that belched gouts of living ammunition. Garen barely had time to process Jorek's death before he was firing again, screaming hoarse curses into the storm. The scions rallied the defense with brutal efficiency, their sergeant cutting down anything that breached the trench. For a moment, it seemed they might hold. Then the synapse creatures arrived. Towering hive tyrants strode through the battlefield like living engines of war, their psychic presence whipping the tyrannid swarm into a frenzy. One of them unleashed a psychic scream that shattered the eardrums of half the trench defenders. Men dropped their weapons, clutching their heads as blood poured from their noses. The scions fired plasma guns at it, but the creature's carapace absorbed the blows like rain. Panic swept the line like wildfire. Detonation collars flared as deserters tried to flee. Garen felt the world narrowing to the barrel of his gun, the mud beneath his boots, and the unending roar of the alien horde. Through the chaos, he saw Illyra climbing onto the trench lip, waving a signal flare, shouting orders he couldn't hear over the din. Somehow, impossibly, people responded. They rallied around her, reforming firing squads, dragging heavy weapons into new positions. It wasn't enough to win, but it was enough to not die yet. Garen found himself moving toward her without thinking, his lasgun spitting crimson bolts, his throat raw. He didn't know why, maybe because in this place of death, she was the only figure that looked alive. And as the tyrannid swarm pressed closer, as the trench threatened to collapse, Garen realized something terrifying. He cared if she lived. The days that followed blurred into one another, a grinding nightmare of mud, screams, and blood. Sleep became a memory, food an afterthought, and hope something fragile and dangerous. Garen Vale stopped counting the number of tyrannids they killed. The corpses piled up along the trench line like obscene barricades, seething with flies and acid smoke. What replaced numbers was rhythm. Fire, reload, duck, drag a wounded man back, fire again. It was a rhythm that carved itself into his bones, into the marrow of everyone still alive. Command had abandoned pretense by then. The Penal Legion wasn't expected to hold forever, only long enough. Every night the Vox crackled with clipped reports about evacuation convoys, about fleet withdrawals, about strategic delays. Garen understood the truth without anyone saying it. They were the delay. Their deaths were the cost of others escaping. In some bitter, twisted way, that clarity was a comfort. He knew his place in the galaxy now. The trench stank of death and chemical discharge. Garen huddled beneath a splintered slab of ferrocrete during a lull, his lasgun cradled across his knees, collar light blinking in its slow, steady rhythm. Beside him, Alira was cleaning blood from her hands with a strip of rag that had once been white. Her sleeves were stiff with dried gore. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had learned that hesitation meant more dead bodies to deal with later. "How long do you think we've got?" Garen asked suddenly, the words escaping before he could swallow them. Alira didn't look up. "Long enough for command to finish running," she said flatly. Her bluntness should have stung, but it didn't. He gave a low, humorless chuckle. "I keep hoping they'll surprise us. Maybe drop a few Baneblades out of the sky, maybe some angels." At that she did glance at him. "Space Marines don't come for people like us, Vale. We're the meat shield. We bleed so they don't have to." He nodded slowly. He already knew that, but hearing it spoken so plainly made something in his chest twist. He studied her face in the dim light filtering through the trench, noticing the way the scar down her jawline caught the glow. He wanted to ask her why she was here, what she had done to earn this sentence, but the words stuck in his throat. Everyone in the Penal Legion carried their sins like invisible chains. Asking was a kind of cruelty. Above them, a whistle sounded, a signal that sent every surviving legionnaire scrambling to their positions. Garen and Alira moved with grim familiarity, climbing the firing step, checking charge packs, watching the horizon. The horde was stirring again. The endless tide shifted, reshaping itself like some monstrous organism adapting to resistance. They came at different angles now, probing the defenses with alien cunning. The first wave hit just after dusk. A wall of gaunts sprinted across the mire, their screeches cutting through the rising wind. Garen fired into the mass until his shoulders burned, each shot punching through one creature only for two more to take its place. The trench blazed with lasfire, turning the night into a stuttering hell of red light and shadows. Somewhere down the line, a synapse creature broke through, a tyrannid warrior, taller than a man and far deadlier. It leapt into the trench like a scythe into wheat, tearing through legionnaires before anyone could react. Garen turned just in time to see it drive its talons through a woman's chest, hoist her screaming into the air, then fling her aside like trash. Alira was closer. She didn't hesitate. She vaulted over a pile of sandbags, firing her last pistol into its face while screaming for the heavy weapon teams. "Vale," she shouted, voice hoarse but clear. He moved without thinking, diving for the discarded grenade belt of a fallen soldier. He yanked a frag loose, armed it, and hurled it toward the warrior's feet. The blast staggered the creature, blowing off one limb. It roared, spinning toward him, and for one horrifying moment Garen saw his own death reflected in its gleaming eyes. A heavy bolter opened up from the far end of the trench, the shells punching through the warrior's chest in a wet cascade. It fell, thrashing, then went still. Garen's ears rang from the explosion, his breath tearing in and out of his throat. Alira grabbed his arm, hauling him upright. "Don't freeze again," she snapped. "I didn't." "You did," she cut him off. "Next time it kills you." She was right. He knew she was right. And yet beneath the harshness there was something else in her eyes, not cruelty but fierce urgency. She needed him alive, not because she cared, he told himself, but because every living gun mattered. Still, the way she held his gaze a heartbeat longer than necessary lingered with him long after she let go. The night bled into morning with no real sense of passage. Hours were marked only by the changing pitch of artillery, the ebb and flow of alien attacks, the thinning number of living bodies in the trench. At some point, Garen found himself crouched beside a dying legionnaire who couldn't have been older than 19. The boy clutched Garen's sleeve with blood-slick fingers, eyes wide. "Tell my brother on Vesta Secundus," he gasped. Garen didn't know the boy's name. He lied anyway. "I'll tell him." The boy died with a small, shuddering breath. Garen gently pried his fingers loose. There was no time for graves, no strength for prayers. Elira passed by a moment later, glanced down at the corpse, then at Garen. She said nothing, but the look was enough. She understood. By midday, the trench was holding by sheer stubbornness. Supplies were running dangerously low, morale even lower, but the Scions had brought enough discipline to keep total collapse at bay. Then came the news that changed everything. The Vox crackled to life with the Commissar's strained voice. "Attention all units. Orbital bombardment imminent. Estimated time, 2 hours. Evacuation of command elements proceeding. Penal regiments are to maintain current positions until signal." The reaction was instant and brutal. Some laughed, a few hysterically. Others screamed at the Vox unit, cursing command, the Emperor, fate itself. Garen just stared at the mud, feeling a hollow pit open inside him. Orbital bombardment meant one thing: they were writing the planet off, and anyone still planetside when the fleet began glassing wouldn't survive. Elira was beside him again, her face unreadable. "They're leaving us," he said quietly. "They were always going to," she replied. A nearby soldier snapped, ripping off his collar in a frenzied attempt to escape. It detonated instantly, spraying those closest with gore. The Commissar shot 2 others who tried to run. Order was reimposed through fear and blood, as it always was. Garen watched it all with a numb sort of detachment. He wasn't shocked anymore. The Tyranids didn't give them time to brood. The final push began before the 2 hours were up. The sky filled with winged horrors swooping over the trenches, clawing and screaming. Larger beasts lumbered forward, smashing through the wreckage, psychic shrieks rippling across the battlefield like knives through the air. Garen's head throbbed as the hive mind pressed down like a vice. Elira rallied a group of survivors near the eastern flank, calling Garen to her side. "We hold this line," she shouted over the din. "If they break through here, it's over before the bombardment even starts." He didn't question her authority anymore. He followed, along with a ragged collection of legionnaires who somehow still stood. The eastern trench was already half overrun. They arrived just in time to see a Scion sergeant dragged screaming into the swarm. Garen fired until his rifle overheated, then grabbed a fallen bayonet to stab a gaunt trying to climb over the wall. The world narrowed to a blur of claws, muzzle flashes, and Elira's voice cutting through it all. She moved like a storm, fearless and furious, and Garen found himself anchored by her presence. Even as death closed in, she gave shape to the chaos. Then came the psychic blast. A hive tyrant at the edge of the field unleashed a wave of mental force that ripped through their defenses like a hurricane. Garen felt it as a scream inside his skull, a tearing that made him drop his weapon and clutch his head. Men around him collapsed, bleeding from ears and eyes. Elira staggered but remained standing, her teeth bared in defiance. "Vale," she shouted, grabbing his collar, shaking him back to focus. "Stay with me." He forced his eyes open. Through the haze of pain, he saw the hive tyrant looming, its shadow spilling across the trench like doom itself. And for the first time since his sentencing, Garen felt something other than fear or despair. He felt rage. Rage was a strange thing on the battlefield. It didn't burn hot like a fire, not for Garen Vale. It settled deep and cold, a sharpness that cut through exhaustion, pain, and the gnawing certainty of death. The hive tyrant's psychic pressure pressed down like the sky itself was collapsing, but beneath it he found a bitter clarity. He tightened his grip on the lasgun, forced his shaking hands to steady, and rose alongside Elira as the trench shuddered under the alien onslaught. The eastern flank had become a charnel house. Piles of Tyranid corpses melted into foul-smelling ichor that pooled in the mud, while the bodies of legionnaires lay sprawled like broken dolls, their collars blinking in silent mockery. The hive tyrant advanced slowly, deliberately, as if savoring their fear. Its talons were slick with blood, its crown of bone spines crackling faintly with bioelectric energy. Behind it, the swarm surged forward with renewed fury, their movements unnervingly synchronized, as if the tyrant's will were puppeteering each creature. "Illyra," Garen said, voice rough but steady now, "we can't hold this." "I know," she replied, not looking at him, her eyes fixed on the towering monstrosity ahead. "But we don't have to hold it forever, just long enough." "For what? The fleet's going to burn everything." "For someone to remember we were here," she shot back, and there was something in her tone, a spark of defiance, not against the enemy but against the universe itself. She turned to the surviving soldiers huddled in the trench. "Form up. Heavy weapons on that thing. If we die, we're taking it with us." The commissar overseeing the eastern line was already dead, crushed beneath falling debris, and the chain of command had shattered hours ago. Illyra had become their anchor by sheer will, and Garen followed her orders without hesitation. He grabbed a power pack from a fallen gunner and slotted it into the tripod-mounted lascannon that someone had dragged to the edge. Its barrel was cracked, its targeting array flickering, but it still hummed with barely contained energy. The tyrant shrieked, a psychic sound that bypassed ears and rattled through skulls. Legionnaires screamed, clutching their heads, but the heavy weapons opened up. Streams of lasfire and autocannon rounds hammered the creature's armored hide, punching glowing craters into its carapace. It staggered, enraged rather than wounded, and charged forward. Garen squeezed the trigger on the lascannon. The weapon kicked back with a roar, a concentrated beam slashing across the battlefield and striking the tyrant's left shoulder. Bone and chitin exploded in a shower of alien gore, and the monster screamed again, its gaze locked on him. He barely had time to register the sound before the tyrant leapt. It covered the distance in a horrifying instant, smashing into the trench like a living tank. The lascannon shattered under its weight, the impact throwing Garen backwards into the mud. He tasted blood and metal as his head struck something hard. Through the ringing in his ears, he saw Illyra vault onto a ledge, firing her last pistol directly into the creature's face. "Vale, move," she shouted, but her words came through like distant echoes. The tyrant's tail lashed out, catching a soldier beside Garen and snapping him in half with casual cruelty. Garen scrambled up, diving for his lasgun. He fired blindly, shots scoring the creature's flank but doing little more than drawing its attention back to him. It lunged, talons scything downward. He rolled aside, mud and blood flying as the claws carved into the ground where he'd just been. Illyra hurled a crack grenade, the blast tearing a chunk from its abdomen but failing to slow it significantly. Around them, the line was collapsing. Gaunts poured into the trench, overwhelming the remaining defenders in a tide of shrieking bodies. The Vox was a cacophony of dying screams and static. Somewhere far above, orbital engines were aligning, but down here, that might as well have been another universe. Garen's collar blinked steadily. He thought, absurdly, of the moment it had been fastened around his neck back in the holding cells, of the cold metal against his skin, of the way the guard had smirked as if already knowing where he would die. He felt something harden inside him then, not a desire to live, but a refusal to be erased quietly. He grabbed a fallen plasma gun from a nearby corpse. The weapon was unstable, its vents cracked, but its charge was still live. He rose, mud dripping from his uniform, and faced the tyrant. "Illyra," he shouted hoarsely, "get everyone back." She saw the plasma gun. Her eyes widened, and for the briefest moment there was understanding. She shook her head. "You'll die." "We're all going to die," he said, and there was no fear in it now, only grim acceptance. "Might as well make it count." The tyrant lunged again, and Garen met it halfway, firing the plasma gun at point-blank range. The weapon screamed, overloaded, a surge of unstable energy ripping through the barrel. The blast tore into the creature's chest, melting flesh and bone in a blinding flash. Garen was thrown back by the concussive force, his vision going white. When the smoke cleared, the tyrant was down but not dead. It thrashed wildly, half its torso burned away, psychic rage pouring off it in waves. Garen lay sprawled in the mud, body screaming in pain, the plasma gun reduced to molten slag beside him. Alira appeared, dragging him to cover with strength born of desperation. "You're insane," she hissed, but there was something like fierce pride beneath the anger. "You're welcome," he coughed, blood flecking his lips. Before she could respond, the sky lit up. The first orbital bombardment strikes began, distant at first but rapidly closing. Great spears of light stabbed down from the heavens, turning the horizon into fire. The ground shook violently, the air itself seeming to boil. Vox units crackled with evacuation codes that meant nothing to those still fighting. The bombardment line was moving toward them, fast. Panic tore through what remained of the defenders. Some tried to flee toward the central trench lines, others simply collapsed in despair. Commissars were gone, discipline shattered. The eastern flank was a ruin. "Alira," Garen rasped, trying to sit up despite the pain. "We need to move." She nodded once, jaw tight. She scanned the battlefield, eyes sharp despite the chaos. "There's a drainage tunnel under the central trench, maintenance shafts. If we can reach it, we might avoid the worst of the bombardment." "Might isn't good odds," he said. "It's better than standing here waiting to burn." They rallied what few survivors they could, barely a dozen broken, bloodied souls, and began a desperate retreat through the maze of trenches. Tyranids swarmed around them, but the bombardment was striking indiscriminately now, annihilating friend and foe alike. Garen half ran, half stumbled through mud slick with ichor and blood, clutching his lasgun like a talisman. At one point, a shell strike hit so close the shockwave threw them all to the ground. Garen's ears rang, his vision swam, and when he blinked the mud away, he saw Alira lying motionless a few meters away. His heart clenched, colder than the void. He dragged himself to her side, shaking her roughly. "Alira, Alira, get up." Her eyes fluttered open. She groaned, dazed but alive. He hauled her to her feet, ignoring the agony that flared through his own body. They staggered onward together as the bombardment roared closer. Somewhere ahead, a wounded soldier screamed that the tunnel was caved in. The sound of his voice was swallowed by a massive explosion that vaporized the ground where he stood. Garen and Alira were thrown forward by the blast, tumbling into the mouth of the drainage shaft almost by accident. It was dark, cramped, and half-flooded, but it was shelter. Above, the world was ending in fire. Garen lay on his back in the shallow water, chest heaving, the distant thunder of the fleet's wrath echoing through the stone. Beside him, Alira turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze. There was no need for words. They were still alive, for now. But survival was never simple in the Imperium. Deep in the tunnels, something moved. The bombardment above didn't stop for hours. Even buried beneath meters of ferrocrete and mud, Garen Vale could feel each strike like a distant heartbeat, a relentless pulse shaking the walls around them. The drainage tunnel was barely wide enough for 3 men to crawl through side by side, and the water that pooled inside stank of promethium runoff and rot. It should have been a place of relief, a fragile shelter from the apocalypse raging above, but the silence between impacts was worse. It wasn't the silence of safety, it was the silence of something waiting. Alira crouched at the front of the group, her flashlight casting thin beams along the tunnel walls. Mud dripped from her hair, streaked across her face, but her eyes remained sharp, scanning every corner. Behind her, the remaining Penal legionnaires shuffled nervously, clutching their weapons, the blinking collars around their necks now more like countdown timers than restraints. Most of them hadn't spoken since the retreat. The bombardment had burned away their bravado, their hatred, even their fear. What was left was a kind of numb clarity, the hollow space that comes after too much death. Garen leaned against the tunnel wall, breathing shallowly. His ribs ached from the tyrant's attack. Every movement sent daggers of pain through his chest. He ran a hand through his filthy hair and forced himself to stay alert. He had been through enough campaigns to know that surviving the enemy's assault was only half the war. What came after? The isolation, the attrition, the waiting, often killed more soldiers than any Xenos ever could. "Anything ahead?" he rasped. Illyra shook her head. "It curves about 30 meters down, could lead to the central maintenance shafts, could also lead nowhere." "Or worse," muttered one of the legionnaires behind them, a wiry man named Corvin. His left arm was bandaged with a rag soaked through with blood. "You hear it, don't you? The scratching." The others stiffened. Garen pushed off the wall despite the pain and listened. At first, all he heard was the distant thunder of the bombardment and the occasional drip of water. Then faintly, almost too faint to catch, came the sound, a slow, deliberate scraping, like claws dragging across stone. He met Illyra's eyes. She had heard it too. "It's probably runoff shifting," one soldier said, too quickly, trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "No," Garen replied quietly, "that's not runoff." The scratching stopped abruptly. The tunnel fell into oppressive silence. Corvin swallowed audibly, his collar light blinking like a heartbeat. Then from the darkness ahead came the sound of something breathing. Wet, heavy, wrong. "Emperor preserve us," someone whispered. Garen motioned for everyone to keep quiet. He slung his lasgun up, checked the charge pack, and moved to Illyra's side. The beam of her flashlight was shaking slightly, but her hand was steady. Together, they crept forward down the tunnel, water sloshing around their boots. Each step seemed to stretch time thinner, pulling it taut like a wire ready to snap. They reached the bend. Illyra lifted the flashlight slowly, angling it around the corner. The beam caught movement, a hunched shape pressed against the wall, slick with slime. For a heartbeat, Garen thought it was a genestealer, one of the vanguard horrors that often infested tunnels like this. But then it shifted into the light, and the truth was somehow worse. It was a man, or what had been a man. His penal uniform was still visible beneath layers of mucus and chitin, his collar blinking faintly. His flesh was warped, bones reshaped by some horrific tyrannid infection. Chitinous plates pushed through his skin like broken glass, his jaw distended into something inhuman. He was breathing in short, wet gasps, and his eyes, what remained of them, were wide with a trapped, animal terror. "Saints," Illyra breathed. The creature jerked suddenly, spasming as if fighting itself. Its gaze snapped toward them, and for an instant Garen saw the man beneath the mutation, saw the flicker of recognition and desperate, pleading agony. Then the tyrannid infection won. The spasm ceased, and it lunged. "Contact!" Garen shouted, firing a burst into its chest. The last bolt scorched through warped flesh, but the creature kept coming, unnaturally fast in the narrow space. Illyra fired too, a precise shot that blew out part of its mutated skull, but it still managed to crash into Garen, sending both sprawling into the filthy water. It was stronger than it looked. Its clawed hands scrabbled at his throat, jaws snapping inches from his face. He jammed his lasgun between them, straining to keep it back as its breath hit him like rot and acid. Illyra moved in, kicked the creature off balance, and drove her combat knife into the side of its head with brutal force. It convulsed once, then went still. The tunnel echoed with their heavy breathing. What was that?" Corvin stammered. "Infected," Garen said grimly, pushing the corpse off him. "The tyrannids use more than claws and teeth. They plant spores in the wounded, turn them into that." The others recoiled, horrified. Illyra wiped her knife on the creature's tattered uniform and looked further down the tunnel. "If there's one, there'll be more. We need to move, fast." No one argued. They pressed deeper into the drainage system, following the tunnel as it twisted beneath the shattered hive city. The bombardment above grew more distant, replaced by the constant drip and groan of shifting metal. Twice they passed bodies, other legionnaires, some torn apart, others already half consumed by alien growth spreading like veins across the walls. Eventually, the tunnel opened into a larger maintenance chamber, an intersection of several pipelines and access shafts. Rusted catwalks ran overhead, and in the center stood a rust-stained ladder leading up into darkness. "This connects to the central trenchworks," Alira said, checking the battered map on her datapad. "If we climb, we might find a way back to the surface, maybe even a rally point." "Or we climb into a nest," Corvin muttered. Garen didn't bother to correct him. Both outcomes were equally likely. Before they could decide, a low rumble vibrated through the chamber. Not the steady, distant bombardment, but something closer, something moving. Then the ceiling above them exploded. Chunks of ferrocrete crashed down as tyrannids poured through the breach, gaunts, dozens of them, skittering and shrieking. The legionnaires opened fire instinctively, the enclosed space amplifying every shot into deafening chaos. Lashbolts scorched the darkness, cutting down the first wave, but more were already swarming in. "Up the ladder," Alira shouted. Garen turned to cover the rear, firing until his charge pack ran dry. A gaunt lunged at him. He smashed it in the face with the butt of his gun and shoved it into the water, then grabbed a fresh pack and slammed it home. Around him, men were screaming, dying, fighting with the desperation of cornered animals. He saw Corvin halfway up the ladder, climbing frantically. Alira was at the base, firing upward to clear the way. Garen joined her, their shots coordinated through pure instinct. Then Corvin screamed. Something yanked him off the ladder and into the swarm. His cries were cut short in a wet, tearing sound. "Keep moving," Garen roared, shoving another soldier upward. The chamber had become a death trap. Tyrannids filled every space, their bodies writhing over each other to get closer. Garen grabbed Alira's arm. "Go. I'm not leaving you. Go." For a split second their eyes locked. Then she nodded, turned, and began to climb. Garen stood at the base, firing until his gun overheated, then drawing his combat knife as the gaunts surged toward him. He slashed, stabbed, kicked, anything to buy her more time. Above, she reached the hatch and shoved it open. Blinding light spilled down, not sunlight but the burning glare of the hive city's upper levels still aflame from the bombardment. She disappeared through the opening, then leaned back down, hand outstretched. "Veil." He looked up, blood and mud smeared across his face, and for a moment it was almost absurdly calm. Then he jumped, grabbed her wrist, and she hauled him up with surprising strength. Together they slammed the hatch shut as the gaunts swarmed against it from below. They collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. They had emerged into the ruins of a manufactorum district. The buildings were half collapsed, fires burned in the distance, and the sky was still streaked with orbital fire. Tyrannids roamed the streets like packs of predators. Garen sat up slowly, wincing. Around them, only 4 other legionnaires had made it out. Corvin was gone, so were most of the others. "This isn't survival," one soldier muttered hollowly. "This is just delaying it." Garen didn't have an answer for that. Alira scanned the ruins ahead. "There's a Vox relay tower 2 clicks north. If it's still standing, we can call for extraction." "Extraction?" Someone laughed bitterly. "They're not coming for us." She turned sharply, eyes blazing. "Then we die trying to make them." Garen looked at her, really looked. Mud-streaked, exhausted, half her squad dead, but her gaze burned like a torch in the dark. And something inside him, something that had been long dead, stirred faintly. They were broken soldiers, criminals sent to die on a forgotten world. But not yet, not today. Garen rose slowly, slung his lasgun over his shoulder and met her gaze. "Then let's move." And through the ruined manufactorum, with tyrannids closing in and the sky aflame, they began their final march toward the relay tower. What waited for them? They would decide if their suffering had meant anything at all. The manufactorum ruins sprawled before them like the bones of a dead god. Jagged walls, collapsed silos, conveyor lines twisted into blackened skeletons. Fires crackled fitfully in the distance, smothered by a haze of ash and chemical smoke. The relay tower rose beyond this graveyard, a tall spire of battered steel jutting out of the wreckage. Half its upper frame collapsed from orbital shelling but still faintly blinking with the green light of active systems. 2 kilometers. That was all that separated Garin Vale, Illyria, and the 4 remaining Penal legionnaires from the faintest chance at survival. 2 kilometers through a city already claimed by the Great Devourer. They moved quickly, weapons ready, keeping to the shadows between broken walls and shattered halves. The Tyranids were everywhere now, moving in coordinated hunting packs through the ruins, guided by an intelligence that was both alien and terrifyingly precise. They didn't search like beasts, they swept the streets like an inexorable tide, probing, listening, smelling for survivors. Every sound mattered. Even the crunch of a loose stone could bring death in seconds. Corporal Hensick, a lean man with a scar splitting his upper lip, took point. He served 3 years in the regular guard before his sentence. His movements were sharp and silent, his eyes constantly scanning the upper floors and alleyways for movement. Behind him came Taris, a broad-shouldered former dock worker who held his lasgun more like a club than a rifle. The last 2, Fenna and Rig, were barely more than boys, conscripts who'd stolen food on a hive world and ended up here because the magistratum didn't care about reasons, only quotas. Their collars blinked faintly in the darkness, small lights marking them like prey animals with glowing eyes. Garin stayed close to Illyria, every step sending pain shooting through his ribs. He'd learned to ignore it, to fold the pain into himself like another piece of the uniform he wore. What mattered now was movement, silence, survival. They cut through a collapsed transit station, its once grand archways now choked with rubble. A derailed maglev train lay on its side, its compartments ripped open and filled with gnawed corpses. Fenna gagged at the smell, earning a sharp glare from Hensick. Garin didn't look at the bodies, he couldn't. If he did, he might see familiar faces. Penal legionnaires, guardsmen, civilians, they all ended up the same in the end. Halfway through the station they heard it, a low, thrumming pulse like the beating of some monstrous heart. Garin froze. It wasn't mechanical, it wasn't artillery, it was alive. Up, Hensick hissed, pointing toward a maintenance catwalk that ran along the ceiling. Move quietly. They climbed in silence, hands scraping against rusted metal, boots carefully placed. From their vantage point, they saw it emerge into the ruined station below. A Tyranid synapse creature, taller than a sentinel walker, armored in thick, ridged plates, its maw dripping with mucus. Warrior drones flanked it, moving with unnatural discipline. This was no hunting party. This was a control node, spreading the hive minds will like a spider spinning a web. The creature paused, its head tilting as if listening. Rig's hand slipped. His boot knocked loose a chunk of rusted grating. The metal clattered against the ground below. The Tyranid warrior's head snapped upward. Run, Illyria breathed. They sprinted along the catwalk, the metal groaning beneath their weight. Below, the creature roared, a sound that reverberated through Garin's chest. Tyranid warriors leapt onto the walls, clawing their way upward with terrifying speed. Lasgun fire erupted as Hensick and Taris turned to cover the rear, their shots cutting down the first of the climbing beasts but not slowing the others. The catwalk ended abruptly in a gap where part of the structure had collapsed. On the far side, a maintenance hatch led back into the manufactorum's upper corridors. It was at least a 2-meter jump. "I'll go first," Garin said. Before anyone could argue, he pushed himself off the edge, pain flaring white-hot through his chest as he hit the other side and rolled. He scrambled up, turned, and extended his arms. "Jump." Fenna went next, nearly falling short but catching his arm. He hauled her up, teeth clenched against the pain. Illyria followed, landing with practiced grace. Taris hurled Rig across like a sack of grain, then leapt himself, barely clearing the gap. Hensick came last, firing until the last possible moment, then jumping as a Tyranid warrior lunged beneath him. Its claws missed by inches. He landed hard, rolling to his feet with a snarl. They sealed the hatch behind them. the sound of claws hammering against the metal echoing down the corridor. "That bought us seconds," Hensick spat. "Then let's not waste them," Alira snapped. They ran. Through corridors half-collapsed, through stairwells slick with alien slime, past broken assembly lines where once millions of shells and lastbacks had been produced. Now they were just hollow reminders of Imperial industry, soon to be devoured and repurposed by the hive. As they neared the relay tower's perimeter, the sound of battle grew louder, not human weapons, but the grinding, tearing sounds of tyrannid organisms breaking through defenses. Garen's heart sank when they reached the final stretch. The relay tower stood in the center of what had once been a fortified courtyard. Now the barricades were smashed, the walls cracked, the sandbags soaked with blood. Tyrannids swarmed the outer perimeter, clawing at the steel supports of the tower itself. Imperial defenders, probably a Vox crew and their escorts, had made a last stand here. Their bodies were strewn around heavy stubbers and empty ammo crates. "They're trying to bring it down," Alira whispered. Garen scanned the tower. The main access hatch was still intact, but a dozen gaunts prowled near it, feasting on corpses. Above, the Vox array still blinked weakly. If they could get inside, maybe, just maybe, they could boost a distress signal strong enough for someone in orbit to hear. Hensick exhaled slowly. "We won't get a clean run. We hit them hard, fast, and pray." "Or we die in the open," Taris muttered. Garen looked at Alira. She met his gaze, unflinching. "We're dead anyway if we stay here," she said. He nodded. "Then we fight." They spread out behind the rubble, taking up firing positions. The plan was suicidal but simple. Draw the tyrannids away from the hatch with concentrated fire, then push through in the chaos. "On three," Hensick hissed. 1. Garen tightened his grip on his lasgun. 2. Alira raised her weapon, jaw set. 3. They opened fire. Lastbolts scorched the courtyard, dropping several gaunts instantly. The swarm reacted as one organism, shrieking and turning toward the new threat. Hensick's shots were precise, disciplined. Taris fired like a man trying to hold back the ocean. Fenna and Rigg screamed as they fired, terror giving way to desperate fury. The gaunts surged toward them. "Move," Garen shouted. They broke from cover, sprinting toward the hatch. Hensick lobbed a frag grenade that detonated in the middle of the swarm, buying precious seconds. Taris was the first to reach the door, slamming the control panel. It hissed open, but before he could step inside, a gaunt leapt onto him. He smashed it against the wall, roaring, as Alira put a shot through its head. They piled into the tower, slamming the door shut behind them. Claws hammered against the steel almost immediately. "Up the stairs," Alira ordered. They climbed, lungs burning, boots pounding against the metal. Garen's vision blurred from exhaustion, but he kept going. Above them, the Vox room awaited, a small chamber with shattered windows overlooking the courtyard. They burst inside. The equipment was battered but still functioning. Fenna rushed to the console, hands shaking. "I did a year in Vox operations," she stammered. "I can try." "Do it," Garen said. She began tuning the frequencies, static crackling through the speakers. Outside, the tyrannids were already climbing the tower's frame, their shrieks echoing through the metal. "They're coming," Hensick said grimly, taking position by the doorway. Garen joined him. Alira stood by the window, firing down into the courtyard. Gaunts were swarming up the walls, clawing for the windows. The tower shook as larger organisms slammed against its base. "Signal boosted, transmitting," Fenna cried. "Is anyone out there?" Garen shouted into the Vox. "This is Penal Legion P99721 survivors. We are under assault, Relay Tower Sector 4G. We need immediate evac or orbital strike." "Static." Then faintly, "Copy, signal received, hold position." The room erupted in a mixture of relief and renewed panic. Help might be coming, but could they hold out long enough? The first gaunts broke through the windows. Lasfear filled the room. Rig went down, throat torn open before anyone could help. Hensick fought like a man possessed, his lasgun glowing red-hot. Taras swung his weapon like a club, bellowing defiance. Garen found himself beside Alira, backs pressed together, firing into the swarm as it poured through the shattered walls. "Vale," she shouted over the chaos. He turned. "If we die here," she said, eyes blazing, "we die on our feet." He almost smiled. "Damn right." The tower shook violently. A monstrous screech tore through the air as a Tyranid warrior forced its way through the stairwell, its massive claws tearing the doorway apart. Hensick charged it, firing point-blank, but it swatted him aside like a rag doll. Garen stepped forward without thinking, emptying his lasgun into its chest. Alira joined him, their shots merging into a single, blazing storm. The creature staggered, roared, and fell. Outside, the shriek of atmospheric engines filled the air. A Valkyrie gunship swooped low, autocannons blazing, shredding the swarm below. The Vox crackled. "Hold on, survivors, we've got you." The sight hit Garen harder than any blow. After everything, chains, collars, battles, loss, they had been heard. "Rope line incoming," the pilot shouted. The cable smashed through the shattered window. Alira grabbed Fenna, hauling her to the line. Taras followed, bloodied but alive. Garen was last. He looked back once at the tower, at the bodies of those who hadn't made it, and then grabbed the cable. As they rose into the smoky sky, the relay tower collapsed beneath them, swarmed completely by the Tyranids. The world below was still burning, still dying. But for the first time since his sentence began, Garen Vale felt something unfamiliar in his chest. Hope. The Valkyrie banked toward the distant Imperial lines. Garen looked at Alira, their filthy, exhausted faces illuminated by the red cabin lights. She met his gaze and didn't look away. They were still penal legionnaires. Their lives were still cheap, but they had survived the impossible together, and that meant something. For the first time in a long time, Garen wondered if redemption wasn't just a word commissars used to make men die quietly. Maybe, just maybe, it could be real.